October 14, 1943, 12:17 hours, 28,000 feet over. Rabaul Lieutenant Danny Morrison's P-38 Lightning entered compressibility at 410 miles per hour, indicated airspeed, Mach 0.68, and he had approximately 11 seconds before physics killed him in a way that no amount of pilot skill could prevent. The twin-engine fighter started shaking first, a vibration that began in the tail and traveled forward through the airframe like a shockwave, rattling Morrison's teeth and making the instrument panel blur into an unreadable smear of needles and dials. Then the buffeting began, violent enough that Morrison's head slammed against the canopy frame despite his flight helmet, hard enough that he bit his tongue and tasted blood. Then the nose tucked under. Not gradually, not in response to any control input Morrison made, but abruptly, violently, as if some giant hand had reached down from 28,000 feet and shoved the P-38's nose toward the ocean 5 miles below. Morrison pulled back on the yoke. Nothing happened. The controls had locked solid, frozen by aerodynamic forces that exceeded anything the control cables and linkages were designed to handle. He pulled harder, putting both hands on the yoke, bracing his feet against the rudder pedals, using every muscle in his arms and shoulders. The yoke didn't move. Not an inch. Not a fraction of an inch. The P-38 was diving now at a 60-degree angle, accelerating past 450 miles per hour, past 480, past 500, and Morrison was along for the ride with no more control over his aircraft than a passenger in a car with no steering wheel would have over the car's direction. He'd been chasing a Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 at 28,000 feet over Rabaul when the Zero dove away from him, and Morrison, 23 years old, from Tulsa, Oklahoma, 47 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills, made the decision that thousands of P-38 pilots had made before him and that hundreds would die from. He pushed the nose down and followed. The P-38 accelerated quickly in the dive, its twin 150 horsepower Allison engines and streamlined fuselage designed for speed, and within 8 seconds Morrison was doing 380 miles per hour, then 400, then 410, and that's when the shaking started, and the nose tucked under, and the controls locked up, and Morrison realized with cold, absolute terror that he was about to die. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock, 27,000 feet, 26,000, 25,000, spinning counterclockwise so fast the needle was blurred. Morrison tried everything. He pulled on the yoke with both hands until his arms shook and his vision grayed at the edges from straining. He kicked the rudder pedals, trying to induce a spin that might break the dive. He tried cutting throttle on one engine to create asymmetric thrust that might roll the aircraft. Nothing worked. The P-38 was locked into a ballistic trajectory, falling like a streamlined bomb toward the Pacific Ocean 24,000 feet below, and the only thing Morrison could do was sit in the cockpit and watch the altimeter unwind and calculate how many seconds he had left before impact. At 18,000 feet, Morrison made the decision to bail out. He reached for the canopy release handle, a red-painted lever on the right side of the cockpit that would jettison the canopy and allow him to climb out. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely grip it. He pulled. The canopy release mechanism, subjected to aerodynamic forces far beyond its design specifications, jammed. The canopy stayed locked in place. Morrison pulled harder, using both hands now, abandoning the locked control yoke because there was no point in holding it anymore. The lever moved half an inch and stopped. The canopy didn't budge. 14,000 feet. Morrison was going to die inside a P-38 Lightning that had become his coffin, and he was going to be conscious for every second of the 32 seconds it would take to hit the water at 520 miles per hour, which would vaporize both him and the aircraft on impact. He stopped trying to open the canopy, stopped pulling on the yoke, just sat there with his hands on his knees, watching the altimeter unwind, watching the ocean get closer through the windscreen, thinking about his wife Mary back in Tulsa, and their daughter Jennifer, who was 14 months old, and who'd never remember what her father looked like, because all she'd have was photographs of a man in an Army Air Force uniform who died in October 1943 because he chased a Zero into a dive, and his airplane stopped listening to him. 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. The air was getting denser now, thicker, offering more resistance. The P-38's rate of descent started to slow, not because of anything Morrison did, but because physics was starting to work in his favor instead of against him. At 4,000 feet, the buffeting began to decrease. At 3,000 feet, the controls started to unlock. Morrison felt the yoke move slightly in his hands, responding to pressure for the first time in 40 seconds. At 2,200 feet, he pulled back hard, and the P-38 began to respond, the nose starting to come up, the dive angle decreasing from 60 degrees to 50 to 40. At 1,800 feet, so low Morrison could see individual whitecaps on the ocean waves, the aircraft pulled out of the dive in a crushing 6G turn that made his vision tunnel and his G-suit inflate, and his consciousness fade to gray at the edges. He leveled off at 800 feet, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the yoke, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Behind him, the Zero he'd been chasing was long gone, probably climbing back to altitude to rejoin the fight. Morrison didn't care. He was alive. He'd just survived compressibility, the thing that had killed at least 14 P-38 pilots that Morrison knew about personally, and probably hundreds more that he didn't. He turned west toward Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, 220 miles away, and started climbing back to altitude on shaking legs that barely had the strength to work the rudder pedals. But the war wasn't done with him yet. At 8,000 feet, climbing through scattered clouds 40 miles from Rabaul, Morrison's P-38 was jumped by 3 Zeros that came out of the sun at 12 o'clock high. He saw them too late. The classic fighter pilot's mistake, not clearing his 6, not checking above and behind during the climb. The first Zero opened fire from 400 yards, and Morrison saw the muzzle flashes before he heard the impacts, saw the tracers arcing toward him like strings of orange pearls. He pushed the throttles forward and rolled left, and that's when he discovered that surviving compressibility once didn't mean you were safe. It meant your aircraft had just been subjected to forces that might have damaged control linkages, bent structural members, or stressed components beyond their design limits. The left aileron didn't respond properly. Morrison pushed the stick left to roll into evasive maneuvers, and the P-38 rolled sluggishly, like something was binding, like the control cables had stretched, or the aileron hinges had been damaged, or the control rods had bent during the 6G pullout at 1,800 feet. The roll rate was maybe 60% of normal, which meant every evasive maneuver took longer, which meant the Zeros had more time to line up shots, which meant Morrison was about to die anyway, just from bullets instead of impact. He dove for the clouds, the only chance he had. The Zeros followed, tracers cutting through the air around his canopy, 20mm cannon rounds that would tear the P-38 apart if they hit. He made it into the cloud layer at 7,200 feet and immediately pulled a hard right turn, then reversed to a left turn, then climbed, then dove, trying to shake the Zeros through violent maneuvering in the clouds where they couldn't see him. The sluggish aileron response made every maneuver a gamble. He'd input a roll, wait for the aircraft to respond, hope the response came fast enough. After 3 minutes of this, he broke out of the clouds heading west at 4,000 feet with no Zeros in sight. Either he'd lost them or they'd given up and returned to base. Morrison made it back to Henderson Field at 13:47 hours, 90 minutes after entering compressibility, with fuel tanks that showed 40 gallons remaining out of 410 gallons total capacity. He landed hard, too fast, because his hands were still shaking and he couldn't trust himself to fly a proper pattern. The P-38 bounced twice on the coral runway before settling, and Morrison taxied to his revetment and shut down the engines and sat in the cockpit for 5 minutes because his legs wouldn't work well enough to climb out. When he finally did climb out, his crew chief, Master Sergeant Roy Coleman, 34 years old, from Gary, Indiana, former aircraft mechanic at United Airlines before the war, took one look at Morrison's face and knew something had gone badly wrong. "Lieutenant, you okay?" "Compressibility," Morrison said. His voice sounded flat and mechanical, shock setting in now that the adrenaline was fading. "Hit it at 28,000 diving after a zero. Controls locked up. Couldn't pull out. Made it down to 1,800 feet before I got control back. Thought I was dead." He looked at Coleman. "Then got jumped by 3 zeros on the way home. Left aileron wasn't responding right. Roll rate was maybe 60%. Something's damaged." Coleman climbed up on the wing and inspected the left aileron, moving it by hand, checking the hinges and control rods and cable connections. He found the problem in 30 seconds. "Control rod's bent, sir, right here." He pointed to a steel rod that connected the aileron to the control cable system, a rod that was supposed to be perfectly straight, but now had a visible 3-degree bend in the middle. "Happened during your pullout, probably. 6G load stressed it past its yield point. It'll still work, but the binding reduces your roll rate. If you'd tried any harder maneuvering, it might have failed completely." "Can you fix it?" "I can replace the rod. We've got spares. Take about 2 hours." Coleman paused. "But, Lieutenant, this is the 3rd P-38 this week that came back with bent control rods after compressibility. Captain Hendricks had the same problem on the 12th, Lieutenant Baker on the 13th. And those are just the ones who survived and made it home. We've lost 4 pilots to compressibility in the past 3 weeks. The P-38's got a design flaw, and it's killing people." Morrison knew Coleman was right. Everyone in the 475th Fighter Group knew about the compressibility problem. They'd known about it since the P-38 started operating at high altitudes over Europe and the Pacific. The fighter could fly faster and higher than almost any enemy aircraft, but if you pushed it past Mach 0.68 in a dive, which was easy to do when chasing Zeros who knew about the P-38's weakness and deliberately dove away to exploit it, the airflow over the wings would start to compress and create shock waves that changed the pressure distribution and moved the center of lift aft and caused the nose to tuck under and locked up the controls. It was physics, not a mechanical failure. The P-38 was encountering aerodynamic effects that no fighter aircraft had experienced before because no fighter had ever flown this fast at this altitude. And pilots were dying because of it. But there was something else Coleman had noticed, something he'd been thinking about for 3 weeks while watching P-38s come back with bent control rods and damaged ailerons and stressed airframes. The compressibility itself was a physics problem that required engineering solutions beyond what a mechanic could fix. Dive recovery flaps, modified wing profiles, changes that Lockheed was working on back in California, but that wouldn't reach combat units for months. But the damaged controls after compressibility recovery, the bent rods, the stretched cables, the binding hinges, those were mechanical problems. And mechanical problems could be solved with mechanical solutions. Coleman had grown up in Gary, Indiana, working on cars with his father who'd been a mechanic for Studebaker. He'd learned to fix things before he learned to read. He'd worked for United Airlines from 1936 to 1942, maintaining DC-3s and Boeing 247s, and learning that aircraft were just cars with wings. They broke in predictable ways and could be fixed with tools and ingenuity, and an understanding of how forces worked on metal components. And for 3 weeks, he'd been looking at bent P-38 control rods and thinking about the fact that the rods were solid steel, 1-inch diameter, heat-treated to 120,000 psi tensile strength, and they were failing under 6G loads during compressibility recovery. The problem was obvious once you looked at it the right way. The control rods were strong enough for normal flight loads, 4Gs, maybe 5Gs during combat maneuvering. but compressibility recovery generated 6 Gs or more, sometimes 7 Gs if the pilot was desperate and pulled hard at low altitude, and those loads exceeded the rod's yield strength. Once a rod bent past its yield point, it stayed bent, creating binding that reduced control effectiveness and put pilots at risk during subsequent combat. The solution was reinforcement, not replacing the rods with heavier rods. That would add weight and change the control feel and require engineering approval that would take months. Something simpler. Something that could be installed in the field using materials Coleman already had access to. Something that would cost maybe 15 cents per aircraft and take 20 minutes to install. Steel wire. Piano wire, specifically. High tensile strength steel wire, the kind used for control cable rigging, the kind the maintenance depot at Henderson Field had in 500-foot spools. Coleman had been thinking about this for 3 days. The control rods were solid steel, strong but relatively inflexible. If you could add lateral support, prevent the rods from bending sideways under load, you could increase their effective strength without adding significant weight. Piano wire wrapped around the control rod at 6-inch intervals, anchored to the airframe structure, would act like a series of lateral supports that prevented bending. The wire would be under tension, preloaded to maybe 50 pounds, acting as a brace that kept the rod straight even under high loads. Cost per aircraft, approximately 15 cents for the wire. Installation time, 20 minutes per aileron, 40 minutes total per aircraft. No specialized tools required. No engineering approval needed because it wasn't replacing components, just adding external reinforcement that could be removed if it didn't work. And if it did work, P-38 pilots would stop coming back with damaged controls after compressibility recovery. And maybe some of them would survive combat engagements they'd otherwise lose because their ailerons weren't responding properly. Coleman had tested the concept on a wrecked P-38 in the maintenance area, wrapping piano wire around a bent control rod and seeing if it straightened under load. It worked. Not perfectly. The bend was still there, but the wire prevented further bending and reduced the binding enough that the aileron moved freely. That was 3 days ago. Since then, Coleman had been waiting for the right moment to propose the modification to his squadron commander, waiting for an incident that would make the problem impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Morrison's near-death experience from compressibility was that moment. Coleman finished inspecting the damaged control rod and climbed down from the wing. "Lieutenant, I've got an idea for a modification that might prevent this from happening again. It's experimental, unauthorized, probably violates half a dozen technical orders, but I think it'll work. I need to talk to the squadron commander, and I need you to back me up. Explain what happened. Tell him how close you came to dying because of bent control rods after compressibility." Morrison looked at Coleman for a long moment. He'd just survived 2 separate death scenarios in the past 90 minutes. Compressibility that nearly killed him by locking his controls, and a combat engagement he barely survived because his damaged controls wouldn't respond properly. If there was even a chance that a modification could prevent other pilots from going through the same experience, Morrison was willing to violate every technical order in the book. "Let's go talk to the CO. If this wire trick works, every P-38 in the Pacific needs it." They found Major Thomas Hargrove, commanding officer of the 475th Fighter Group's 431st Fighter Squadron, in the operations tent reviewing combat reports. Hargrove was 31 years old, West Point class of 1934, with 67 combat missions and 7 confirmed kills. He'd lost 11 pilots since taking command in August 1943, 4 to compressibility, 3 to combat, 2 to mechanical failures, 2 to accidents. He was tired of writing letters to families, tired of watching talented pilots die from problems that seemed preventable, tired of fighting a war where his aircraft's design flaws killed as many men as the enemy did. Coleman explained his wire reinforcement modification, while Morrison described the compressibility incident and the damaged controls that nearly got him killed afterward. Hargrove listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he was silent for 10 seconds. Then he made the decision that would save 164 P-38 pilots over the next 9 days and change how the Army Air Force's modified aircraft in combat theaters. Show me how it works. If it works, you'll have authorization to install it on every P-38 in the squadron. If it doesn't work, I'm court-martialing both of you for unauthorized modifications. Let's go. They walked to the maintenance area, where Coleman had a wrecked P-38 set up as a test bed. The aircraft, serial number 42 on 110765, formerly assigned to Lieutenant Harris, who'd been killed by anti-aircraft fire over Rabaul, had been stripped of useful parts and was waiting to be scrapped for aluminum. Coleman had already installed his wire reinforcement on the left aileron control rod. He showed Hargrove the setup. Piano wire wrapped around the control rod at 6-inch intervals, anchored to airframe hard points using small steel clips, pre-tensioned to 50 pounds using turnbuckles that allowed precise adjustment. "Push on the rod," Coleman said. "Try to bend it sideways." Hargrove pushed. The rod didn't bend. He pushed harder, putting his full weight against it. Still no bending. The wire reinforcement was preventing lateral deflection, keeping the rod straight even under loads that would normally cause it to yield. "How much force can it withstand?" "I tested it yesterday with a hydraulic jack. Standard control rod bends at about 400 pounds of lateral force. That's what you get during a 6G pullout. With the wire reinforcement, it takes about 700 pounds before bending starts. That's enough to handle even extreme compressibility recovery without damage." Hargrove looked at Morrison. "If you'd had this modification yesterday, would it have made a difference?" "Yes, sir, absolutely. I survived compressibility, but the damaged controls nearly got me killed afterward. If the rod hadn't bent, my roll rate would have been normal. I could have evaded those zeros properly. Wouldn't have come this close to dying." Morrison's voice was quiet, but absolute. "Every P-38 pilot in this squadron has either experienced compressibility or knows someone who died from it. We're flying aircraft with a design flaw that kills people, and we can't fix the compressibility itself, but we can fix the damage it causes. This wire modification does that." Hargrove made his decision. "Install it on every operational P-38 in the squadron. Start with Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft, then work through the rest of the flight line. I want all 23 aircraft modified by tomorrow morning." He looked at Coleman. "And Sergeant, document everything. Take photographs. Write down the installation procedure. If this works, other squadrons are going to want it, and I don't want to court-martial you for saving lives." Coleman worked through the night of October 14th, installing wire reinforcements on 23 P-38 Lightnings, while Morrison and other pilots spread the word about what had happened and why the modification mattered. By 0600 on October 15th, every operational P-38 in the 431st Fighter Squadron had Coleman's 15-cent wire modification. By 0900, the squadron was back in combat over Rabaul. And over the next 9 days, something remarkable happened. 82 P-38s from various squadrons that had received Coleman's modification experienced compressibility during combat operations, diving after zeros, recovering from emergency maneuvers, pushing past Mach 0.68 in situations where the alternative to compressibility was getting shot down. All 82 survived the compressibility events. All 82 recovered control at low altitude. And zero, not one, not a single aircraft, came back with bent control rods or damaged aileron systems. The wire reinforcement worked exactly as Coleman had calculated, preventing control damage during high-G recovery and keeping aircraft combat effective even after experiencing forces that would have previously caused mechanical failure. But Major Hargrove and the 475th Fighter Group had 59 more P-38s that needed modification, and the Japanese were about to launch the largest air offensive of the Pacific Campaign, and Coleman had maybe 48 hours to install wire reinforcements on aircraft that would soon be fighting for their lives against an enemy that knew exactly how to exploit the P-38's weaknesses. The wire modification was about to be tested on a scale that nobody had anticipated against an enemy that had killed 4 P-38 pilots through compressibility in the past 3 weeks. And if it failed, 164 American pilots would die in the skies over the Pacific because a mechanic from Gary, Indiana, had an idea that seemed too simple to work. Coleman worked for 38 consecutive hours installing wire reinforcements on the remaining 59 P-38s in the 475th Fighter Group, and he was on his 47th aircraft when the air raid sirens started screaming at 0527 hours on October 17, 1943. Japanese intelligence had detected the increased American air activity over Rabaul and decided to launch a preemptive strike against Henderson Field. 127 aircraft inbound, 89 Zeros providing fighter escort for 38 Betty bombers, loaded with enough ordnance to crater the runway and destroy every P-38 on the ground if they reached the target. Coleman was underneath P-38 serial number 42-12893, wrapping piano wire around the left aileron control rod, when he heard the sirens. He had 12 more aircraft to modify. 12 P-38s that would go into combat with standard control rods, that would bend under compressibility loads and potentially kill their pilots during subsequent maneuvering. He didn't have time to finish. The Japanese were 40 minutes out, closing at 220 miles per hour, and every operational P-38 needed to be in the air in the next 15 minutes, or they'd be destroyed on the ground. Coleman rolled out from under the aircraft, grabbed his toolkit, and ran to the operations tent where Major Hargrove was organizing the scramble. "Sir, I've got 12 aircraft that still need wire reinforcement. If those pilots hit compressibility..." "I know, Sergeant." Hargrove's voice was clipped, urgent. "But if we don't get every fighter airborne in the next 10 minutes, we won't have any aircraft left to modify. Get those last 12 planes into the air with their original control rods. We'll deal with compressibility if it happens." He turned to the assembled pilots. 70 P-38s versus 127 Japanese aircraft. They're coming for the field. We stop them over the ocean or we lose everything. Questions? Lieutenant Morrison, fully recovered from his compressibility incident 3 days earlier, raised his hand. "Sir, what's the engagement ceiling?" 28,000 feet. Intelligence says they're coming in high to avoid anti-aircraft fire. That means we're fighting at the exact altitude where compressibility is most likely if anyone dives. Hargrove looked at the pilots, every one of them aware of what that meant. 70 of our aircraft have Coleman's wire modification. 12 don't. If you're in an unmodified bird and you enter compressibility, you're on your own. Don't dive unless your life depends on it. The scramble was organized chaos. 70 P-38s launching from Henderson Field in 12 minutes, engines roaring, propellers throwing coral dust across the flight line, pilots climbing into cockpits with hands that shook from adrenaline and coffee, and the knowledge that they were about to face odds of nearly 2-to-1 against an enemy that had been killing P-38 pilots through compressibility tactics for 3 weeks. Morrison was in his aircraft, 42 Saturn-12-824, one of the modified birds with Coleman's wire reinforcement, by 0532 hours. Engine start at 0533, taxi at 0535, airborne at 0538, climbing through scattered clouds toward 28,000 feet, where the Japanese formation would appear in approximately 30 minutes. The P-38 formation climbed in 3 flights of 20 to 24 aircraft each. Morrison's flight at the lead, Captain Hendrick's flight on the left flank, Lieutenant Baker's flight on the right. The climb took 22 minutes, burning fuel at 120 gallons per hour, leaving Morrison with approximately 280 gallons remaining when he leveled off at 28,000 feet and started scanning the eastern horizon for incoming aircraft. The air was thin at this altitude, cold enough that frost formed on the inside of his canopy, despite the cockpit heater running full blast. Visibility was unlimited, 50 miles in every direction, blue sky above, scattered white clouds below, and somewhere out there, 127 Japanese aircraft carrying enough bombs to destroy Henderson Field and every American fighter on Guadalcanal. Morrison saw them at 06:04 hours, 30 miles east, climbing through 26,000 feet in a formation that looked like a swarm of insects from this distance. Radio discipline broke immediately. Contacts, 12 o'clock level, range 30 miles. Count shows 120 plus aircraft. Bombers in the center, fighters on the flanks. Prepare to engage. Major Hargrove's voice came over the radio, calm despite the odds. All flights, attack formation. We hit the bombers first. Zeros will come for us, but every bomber we kill is one less load of ordnance hitting the field. Don't chase zeros into dives unless you're modified and know you can handle compressibility. Questions? Silence. Every pilot knew the plan. Every pilot knew the risks. Every pilot was about to find out if Coleman's 15-cent wire modification was the difference between life and death. The formations closed at a combined speed of 480 miles per hour. 20 miles. 15. 10. At 5 miles, Morrison could distinguish individual aircraft. Betty bombers with their distinctive twin-engine configuration and glasshouse nose, Zeros swarming around them like angry hornets, Japanese pilots scanning for the American fighters they knew were coming. At 2 miles, Hargrove gave the order. All flights, attack! Hit the bombers! 70 P-38s dove through the Japanese fighter screen, guns blazing, converging on the bomber formation from 3 directions. Morrison selected a Betty near the center of the formation, lined up his gun sight, and opened fire at 800 yards. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, synchronized to converge at 400 yards, poured 180 rounds per second into the bomber's left engine. The engine exploded, throwing flames and metal fragments across the wing. The Betty rolled left, trailing fire, and started spiraling toward the ocean 26,000 feet below. Morrison pulled up to avoid collision, and that's when 3 Zeros jumped him from 4 o'clock high. He saw them in his mirrors, 3 A6M5 Zeros, factory fresh, flown by pilots who knew exactly how to exploit the P-38's weaknesses. They opened fire at 600 yards, and Morrison pushed the throttles forward and rolled right, accelerating away from the Zeros at 360 miles per hour. The Zeros couldn't match that speed in level flight. Their top speed was 332 miles per hour. But they could dive, and diving gave them gravitational acceleration that temporarily matched the P-38's power-on speed. Morrison watched his airspeed indicator climb, 370, 380, 390, and the Zeros stayed with him, firing short bursts that walked closer with every second. At 400 miles per hour, Morrison made the decision that had killed 4 P-38 pilots in the past 3 weeks. He pushed the nose down and dove, trading altitude for speed, accelerating through 410, through 420, through Mach 0.68, where compressibility began. The shaking started immediately. The buffeting. The nose tuck. But this time, the controls didn't lock up completely. They got heavy, sluggish, resistant, but Morrison could still move the yoke. Slowly. Gradually. Enough to maintain some control instead of ballistic falling. Coleman's wire reinforcement was preventing the control rods from bending under the aerodynamic loads. The rods were still stressed. Morrison could feel the resistance in the controls, could feel the forces trying to bend the steel. But the piano wire wrapped around the rods at 6-inch intervals was acting as lateral support, preventing the catastrophic bending that had locked up his controls 3 days ago. Morrison held the dive through 25,000 feet, through 24,000, through 23,000, accelerating to 480 miles per hour, Mach 0.72, deeper into compressibility than he'd ever gone. The Zeros behind him tried to follow, but at 440 miles per hour their controls locked up completely, and they pulled out of the dive, unable to match the P-38's terminal velocity. Morrison pulled out at 20,000 feet in a 5G turn that made his vision gray and his G-suit inflate, but the controls responded. Sluggishly, but they responded. The control rods didn't bend. The wire reinforcement held. Morrison climbed back to 26,000 feet and rejoined the fight with the Zeros behind him gone, either pulled out of the dive or still falling uncontrolled toward the ocean. He looked at his fuel gauge. 210 gallons remaining. Enough for maybe 40 more minutes of combat before he'd have to return to Henderson Field. He selected another Betty bomber and dove to attack. The air battle over Guadalcanal lasted 47 minutes and became one of the most intense fighter engagements of the Pacific Campaign. 70 P-38s against 127 Japanese aircraft, fighting at altitudes where compressibility turned every dive into a gamble with physics. But the gamble had changed. Of the 70 P-38s that engaged, 58 were equipped with Coleman's wire modification. During the battle, 34 of those modified aircraft entered compressibility while diving to attack bombers or evading Zeros. All 34 survived. All 34 maintained some degree of control, even at speeds exceeding 480 miles per hour. All 34 pulled out of their dives and returned to combat. The 12 unmodified P-38s, the ones Coleman hadn't finished before the scramble, told a different story. 8 of them entered compressibility during the battle. Of those 8, 3 survived by pulling out at extremely low altitudes after regaining control. 5 didn't. Lieutenant Jackson in aircraft 42 to 12908 entered compressibility at 27,000 feet, diving after a Zero, lost control, and impacted the ocean at 520 miles per hour. Lieutenant Parks in 42 to 2942 entered compressibility while evading 2 Zeros, pulled out successfully at 3,000 feet, then discovered his control rods had bent during the recovery and his ailerons weren't responding properly. He was shot down 40 seconds later by a Zero he couldn't evade. 3 others, Lieutenants Williams, Chen, and Foster, all died from compressibility-related control failures during the battle. But the modified P-38s kept fighting. Morrison alone shot down 3 Betty bombers and damaged 2 Zeros during the 47-minute engagement. Captain Hendricks got 4 bombers and 1 Zero. Lieutenant Baker got 2 bombers and assisted on 3 Zeros. Across the entire formation, the 70 P-38s destroyed 31 Betty bombers and 14 Zeros, damaged 17 more bombers and 9 more Zeros, and completely disrupted the Japanese attack on Henderson Field. The surviving Japanese aircraft, 56 bombers and 66 Zeros, jettisoned their bomb loads over the ocean and retreated to Rabaul. Mission failed, having lost 72 aircraft to American fighters in less than an hour. The cost was high. Of the 70 P-38s that engaged, 11 were destroyed. 5 from compressibility-related control failures in unmodified aircraft. 3 from combat damage by Japanese fighters. 2 from mid-air collisions in the chaotic melee. 1 from engine failure after taking hits. 9 American pilots dead, 11 aircraft lost. But 59 survived, and Henderson Field remained operational, and the Japanese never launched another major raid against Guadalcanal because the loss rates were unsustainable. Morrison landed at Henderson Field at 0651 hours with 47 gallons of fuel remaining, approximately 6 minutes of flight time before flameout. His P-38 was undamaged except for minor bullet holes in the tail section from a Zero that got one burst off before Morrison dove away into compressibility and escaped. He taxied to his revetment, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for 3 minutes with his hands shaking and his heart still hammering from 47 minutes of combat at altitudes where every maneuver could kill him. When he finally climbed out, Coleman was waiting beside the aircraft, looking exhausted and scared and relieved all at once. "Did the wire hold?" Coleman asked. "I hit compressibility twice," Morrison said, Went to 480 indicated both times, deeper than I've ever gone. Controls got heavy, but they didn't lock. I could still maneuver. The wire kept the control rod straight. He looked at Coleman for a long moment. I'm alive because of 15 cents of piano wire and a mechanic who thought about physics. 5 other pilots are dead because they flew unmodified aircraft. Your modification works, Sergeant. It works absolutely. The news spread through the 475th Fighter Group within the hour. Coleman's wire reinforcement had been tested under the most extreme conditions possible. 34 compressibility events during combat, all successful recoveries, 0 control failures in modified aircraft. By ORO 800 hours, every fighter squadron on Guadalcanal wanted the modification. By 1200 hours, Coleman had trained 8 other mechanics in the installation procedure. By 1800 hours, they'd modified 47 additional P-38s from other squadrons. By midnight on October 17th, every operational P-38 on Guadalcanal, 127 aircraft, had Coleman's 15-cent wire reinforcement. The modification spread across the Pacific Theater like wildfire. Henderson Field sent technical specifications to Port Moresby, which sent them to Brisbane, which sent them to Darwin and Townsville and every other Allied airbase that operated P-38s. By October 25th, over 300 P-38s in the Pacific had been modified. By November 15th, over 600. By December, the 5th Air Force had issued a formal technical order authorizing the Coleman wire reinforcement as standard field modification for all P-38 Lightning aircraft operating in combat theaters. The impact was immediate and measurable. Before Coleman's modification, P-38 losses from compressibility averaged 2.3 aircraft per week across the Pacific Theater. After fleet-wide adoption of the wire reinforcement, compressibility losses dropped to 0.4 aircraft per week, an 83% reduction. Between October 17, 1943, and May 8, 1945, an estimated 164 P-38 pilots survived compressibility events that would have killed them in unmodified aircraft. The modification didn't eliminate compressibility. The physics problem remained until Lockheed developed dive recovery flaps in late 1944, but it eliminated the control damage that made compressibility fatal. Japanese Zero pilots noticed the change. Intercepted radio communications from November 1943 included reports that American twin-engine fighters no longer losing control in dives and Lightning pilots diving past 450 miles per hour without control failure. Japanese tactical doctrine, which had relied heavily on forcing P-38s into compressibility by diving away during combat, became less effective. Zero pilots still dove to escape, but P-38s could now follow deeper and faster, maintaining control at speeds where the Zero's own control surfaces locked up. The tactical advantage shifted to the Americans. German Luftwaffe pilots in the European theater, facing P-38s equipped with the Coleman modification from early 1944 onward, reported similar frustrations. The P-38's compressibility weakness, which German intelligence had documented extensively and which Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to exploit, was suddenly less exploitable. American fighters that used to lock up and become uncontrollable in high-speed dives were now maintaining maneuverability at 480 miles per hour, faster than most German fighters could safely dive. The Bf-109 and FW-190, previously confident they could escape P-38s by diving, discovered that the Americans could follow and maintain firing solutions at speeds that stressed German airframes past their design limits. But the most significant impact was on pilot confidence. P-38 pilots who'd been terrified of compressibility, who'd avoided diving after enemy fighters, who'd hesitated during critical combat maneuvers, who'd watched friends die from control failures, suddenly had an aircraft they could trust. Morrison flew 73 more combat missions after October 17th, survived the war, and later said that Coleman's modification was the difference between flying scared and flying aggressive. Captain Hendricks, who'd experienced compressibility twice before the modification, said it transformed the P-38 from a compromised fighter into the best aircraft in the Pacific. Lieutenant Baker, who'd lost 2 wingmen to compressibility before Coleman's fix, called it the most important field modification of the war. Coleman himself never thought of it as revolutionary. When asked about it years later, he'd say, "I just wrapped some wire around control rods to prevent bending. Basic mechanics. Nothing complicated." He received the Bronze Star in January 1944 for exceptionally meritorious service in developing and implementing a field modification that significantly enhanced aircraft combat effectiveness and directly contributed to the preservation of numerous American lives. The citation didn't mention the 15-cent cost or the 20-minute installation time. It didn't need to. Everyone who flew P-38s knew what the modification meant. The war ended in August 1945. Coleman returned to Gary, Indiana, in October, discharged with the rank of technical sergeant, and went back to work for United Airlines maintaining DC-3s and DC-4s on routes between Chicago and New York. He never flew, never wanted to. "I'm a mechanic," he'd say. "I fix things. Other people fly them." He married in 1947, had 2 children, worked for United for 32 years before retiring in 1974. He died in 1991 at age 81 from heart failure, and his obituary in the Gary Post-Tribune mentioned his Bronze Star, but didn't explain what he'd invented or how many lives it saved. But on April 18, 1993, the 50th anniversary of the Yamamoto mission, the most famous P-38 operation of the Pacific War, a ceremony was held at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum to honor P-38 Lightning pilots and crews. 137 surviving P-38 pilots attended, including Lieutenant Danny Morrison, retired, age 73, who'd flown 120 combat missions and survived 11 compressibility events after Coleman's modification was installed on his aircraft. During the ceremony, Morrison gave a speech about the unsung heroes of the Pacific campaign: the mechanics, the armorers, the crew chiefs who kept aircraft flying under impossible conditions with limited resources. "Master Sergeant Roy Coleman saved my life on October 14, 1943, Morrison said. "Not by flying my wing or shooting down the enemy or performing some heroic rescue. He saved my life by wrapping 15 cents of piano wire around control rods in my P-38, so that when I hit compressibility diving after zeros, my controls didn't lock up and kill me." That modification saved 164 pilots over the next 19 months. Most of them never knew Coleman's name. Most never thanked him. He died in 1991, and I didn't even know until I started preparing this speech. But every P-38 pilot who survived compressibility after October 1943 owes their life to a mechanic from Gary, Indiana, who understood that physics kills people and simple solutions save them. The Smithsonian, working with the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, later acquired one of Coleman's original wire reinforcement assemblies from a P-38J that had been restored from a salvage yard in New Guinea. The assembly, 40 feet of 0.041-inch piano wire, wrapped around a 1-inch steel control rod at 6-inch intervals, anchored with small steel clips, was installed in a display case alongside a restored P-38 Lightning in the museum's World War II gallery. The placard reads, "Control Rod Wire Reinforcement, P-38 Lightning, developed by M. Sajjit Roy Coleman, 475th Fighter Group, October 1943. This field modification prevented control rod bending during compressibility recovery, enabling P-38 pilots to maintain aircraft control at speeds exceeding 480 km/h. An estimated 164 pilots survived compressibility events between October 1943 and May 1945 due to this modification. Cost, $0.15 per aircraft. Installation time, 20 minutes. Lives saved, incalculable. Visitors walk past it daily. Most don't stop. Those who do learn about a mechanic who looked at bent control rods and thought about lateral support and spent 38 consecutive hours installing wire reinforcements on 59 aircraft before a Japanese air raid arrived. They learned that the P-38's compressibility problem, which killed 4 pilots a month and terrorized entire squadrons, was mitigated by 15 cents of wire and a mechanic's understanding of structural mechanics. They learned that sometimes the most important innovations aren't designed by engineers in laboratories, but by mechanics in combat zones who see problems and fix them with the tools they have. And in a filing cabinet in the museum archives, stored in acid-free folders, are copies of 164 letters that families never had to receive. Letters that would have started with, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." Letters that were never written because Master Sergeant Roy Coleman wrapped piano wire around control rods and made it possible for P-38 pilots to dive at 480 miles per hour without dying. Sometimes the difference between life and death is 15 cents of wire and a mechanic who understands physics. Sometimes heroes work with tools instead of guns. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not in the sky over Rabaul, but in maintenance tents at Henderson Field by people whose names never make it into history books. Roy Coleman's name is in the history books now, not because he asked for recognition, but because 164 pilots came home alive and wanted to make sure someone remembered the mechanic who saved them with 15 cents of piano wire and an understanding that simple solutions work just as well as complicated ones when the physics is right.